The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
I'm Bruce G. McCarthy, your host for the next 1 hour, and you are listening to Datum Line. In our last three Datum Line broadcasts, Dictatorship of Debt Part 22, 23, and 24, we linked to our YouTube visual presentation, Bank Fraud in 10 Minutes, to demonstrate at a glance the fundamental characteristics of America's constitutional monetary system that was once in close conformity to biblical standards. We compared this to the fiduciary credit system of today that ultimately depends on public confidence in those who confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the public's wealth or goods and services. This is why the Federal Reserve System, our central bank under the Communist Manifesto's fifth plank, is responsible for maintaining public confidence in the system of 100% bank credit. The word credit being derived from the Latin word credere, which means to believe. Do you believe in the Federal Reserve System as your personal savior? Silly as this may sound, central banking became a global religion, receiving far more daily worship and respect from the average person than the religious faith to which he or she claims to subscribe. Readily apparent to the viewer was the harmony between those gold and silver coins of long ago, which reflected the law of just weights and measures found in Scripture, a principle irrelevant in today's system of federally licensed theft. It was also evident that gold and silver were being used as money, since the size and weight of those metals varied directly with the denomination stamped on those coins in the decimal system of 100 cents to $1. By contrast, two of today's copper-nickel tokens, the dime and the Susan B. Anthony dollar, so-called, show a marked decrease in size from the larger 5 and 50 cent tokens, while claiming to be twice the value thereof. This is your prima facie evidence that the copper-nickel are not being used as money, but rather a sum of intangible faith, confidence, credit, or debt, according to the Federal Reserve. They could just as easily have chosen the words ignorance or even stupidity, but those would have sounded too offensive despite their greater accuracy. No point in agitating the victims who might want to throw off the yoke of their oppressors. Less obvious to the victims of bank fraud is the nonsensical relationship between equal-sized Federal Reserve notes, there being no more paper, labor, or ink in a $100 bill than, let's say, a $1 bill. Thus it is that counterfeiters prefer printing hundreds, since they don't cost any more than ones. No tangible asset belonging to the Federal Reserve System, not even paper, ink, or labor, is weighed or measured in dollars. No wealth of any kind is on deposit with or pledged by the Federal Reserve System as collateral to validate their dishonored notes. It's their unique ability to legally steal your wealth that infuses them with sufficient subjective or psychological value to keep this confidence game going. Now, if people believe a dollar is a piece of paper, then cutting it in half should create two 50-cent pieces, right? So why can't you spend them as such? Because a Federal Reserve note is not money, cash, capital, wealth, or an asset, no matter how often they're referred to as such. However, it was once possible to cut gold or silver into smaller pieces and still spend them in a free market. Today's message? Well, economic myths, the science of deceit, part 1 in a new series. And we will be discussing in the next few broadcasts the many myths that sustain the modern system of economics. Our message today is entitled Economic Myths, the Science of Deceit, part 1 in our new series, still in the subject of economics. In our last message, I divided the world of money and monetary reform into two opposing camps: those who advocate for gold and silver as money versus those, who, along with the banking cartel and the likes of Karl Marx, champion the use of nothing as a medium of exchange. While a Federal Reserve note surely does pass from hand to hand, like a bad check written by a common thief, it exports and imports nothing in direct proportion to the unit of measure printed on its face. If you were to try to do that, you'd go to jail. Now, despite the moral and criminal implications of this practice, every country on the face of the globe has followed our lead by imposing this most efficient and expeditious method of confiscatory taxation ever devised, and which the public finds almost impossible to avoid. So it is that monetary reformers, almost without exception, champion this position, its popularity sustained by deceit, confusion, and convoluted myths built upon a vocabulary of absurd and inaccurate definitions. Not long ago, when asking a restaurant employee for some butter, she pointed to a crock that was filled with little packets of margarine. When I pointed out that butter came from cows, but that margarine came from plants in a chemistry set, she exclaimed, "Oh, you mean the regular butter?" Now, this is just another example of how two people can operate with two different definitions for one commonly recognized word. Now, in today's message, we'll be addressing one of the many myths to which we all fell victim as a result of different definitions, coupled with deceitful practices of the bankers who wield magic pens to create what they have cleverly convinced us to call money. You know, it's almost axiomatic that if you believe, as I do, that we should be using something tangible as money, like gold and silver or copper, then you will be accused of belonging to a reactionary backwoods economic brotherhood who mindlessly advocate America's return to what they call the gold standard. The discussion typically takes on a pugilistic tone when your opponent employs ad hominem tactics, perhaps calling you a gold bug. Years ago, I received a phone call from a pastor who, after someone had given him a copy of my first book, which I had written back in 1980, Credit is Debt is Slavery, almost immediately turned what should have been a pleasant conversation into a not-so-pleasant event by labeling me right up front as a gold bug. Now, since my book mentions silver as frequently as it did gold, I asked him why he didn't call me a silverfish, for there is such an insect, after all. That question, however, was answered by ignoring that question. Another example of ad hominem tactics occurred when a studious and methodical friend of mine, a three-time author on the subject of money, was curtly told by a fairly well-known monetary reformer to, quote, read a book, when he quietly pointed out that the phrase lawful money was once understood to mean gold and silver coin. Wow. Read a book, said this advocate of credit, which he calls honest money, evidently unaware that the phrase lawful money was defined by federal statute at Title 12, the United States Code, at Section 152, as gold or silver coin of the United States. So it is that confusion can breed dissension, often because one side or the other cannot or will not properly define the words they use. This is not to insinuate that people of my persuasion never get nasty, but it's not the best way to win friends and converts to our cause. Many RBN listeners are no doubt familiar with a profound statement that was expressed by President John Adams in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, written on the 23rd of August, 1787. And it includes these words: all the perplexities, confusions, and distresses in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, as much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. He didn't say the United States Constitution was perfect, or that Americans were incredibly virtuous. But what he did say was that those flaws and resultant consequences couldn't hold a candle to the national distresses caused by the widespread ignorance of money, banking, and credit. I could not agree more, since most people, including our economic leadership, believe coin, credit, and circulation are synonymous. Economic textbooks are so peppered with linguistic nonsense that were it not for the horrendous economic consequences the world is now facing, their contents might pass for the dry wit of Pat Paulson. So now what is this thing called the gold standard, spoken of by nearly every monetary reformer, the general public, and economists, to which so many so-called gold bugs allegedly want us to return? And is it axiomatic that a believer in monetary gold and silver must therefore embrace America's return to the gold standard? The answer to those questions are found by correctly defining the words we're using, which is probably why Voltaire had said, "If you wish to speak with me, sir, please first define your terms." Ask a monetary reformer or the general public to define what they mean by the gold standard, and you will receive a vague and varied response concerning gold certificates which were redeemable in so many dollars worth of gold. But already we have a problem. A dollar's worth of gold, which varies each business day with the so-called fixing of gold prices in London by the Rothschilds, is not synonymous with a dollar weight, I should say, of gold, which by law was to be fixed, just like an ounce, gallon, or cubic yard of any other commodity, and thus was not subject to change or being redefined, ever, let alone daily. Our next problem has to do with redemption, since every IOU, be it a Treasury certificate, United States note, or a private bank note, stated on its face that it was redeemable, despite the fact that never in American history did this delusion become a fact. Banks and even the U.S. Treasury issued lots of solemn promises to pay gold, which had not one speck of gold behind them. Nor was it possible for John Q. American to determine just how much gold was on deposit to redeem however many IOUs were in circulation, since only a few bankers were privy to that kind of information. If you had been caught doing what they were doing, you'd have gone to prison. It's their club, and you ain't in it. So you see, it would be impossible for America to return to this thing called the gold standard, where, as most people believed, 100% of the circulating IOUs were in fact redeemable, because we Americans never partook of such a fantasy. Which brings us to the next level of this charade. The fact that what you and I may have presumed the words meant is not what economists meant or mean by the phrase, the gold standard, because there are no less than 3 different categories of gold standard, with many variations within each of those 3 basic groups. Now, isn't that a fine kettle of fish? So let's begin first by defining those 3, well, in fact, we'll first name those 3 basic classifications of gold standard, and then we'll try to define them, to better understand why we're not communicating in a straight line, since not all of us are evidently reading from the same book, let alone the same page. Yet we're all using the same words. If you thought doctors, lawyers, and judges had a corner on this kind of a market, think again. The 3 basic types are: 1, a gold coin standard; 2nd, a gold bullion standard; 3rd, a gold exchange standard. Now, when you turn to Black's Law Dictionary, and I've got a 5th edition here, and you look up the word or phrase gold standard, here's what Black's Law Dictionary says. And this I'm reading in its entirety. Gold standard, A monetary system in which every form of currency is convertible on demand into its legal equivalent in gold or gold coin. The United States adopted the gold standard in 1900 and terminated it in 1934. See, the standard and it does not refer to several. And yet economists say that there are at least 3 different kinds of gold standards. Welcome back to this segment of Datum Line. Today's message is entitled Economic Myths, the Science of Deceit. And this is part 1, beginning a new series. On the other side of the break, I had quoted from Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, with regards to their definition, that being West Publishing, their definition for gold standard, and you notice that it was only one gold standard that they contemplated, that the United States had adopted the gold standard, and that it was terminated in 1934. They made no mention of there being 3 different kinds of gold standards, or, as the economists point out, that there are variations within those. And I'm going to be going to some economic textbooks, or at least one textbook, and perhaps even a second one might be called a textbook. It reads more like a history lesson in banking. But I want to point out that the gold standard that was defined by blacks is most likely the one that the general public operates by, in that they believe it was a monetary system in which every form of currency is convertible into gold or gold coin. And most people believe that a Federal Reserve note, United States note, gold and silver certificate, that those were currency. I take issue with that. It seems like I stand alone on a lot of things, but I don't mind. Currency, as defined by Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, coined money and such banknotes. That's a misnomer. There's an error right there. A banknote is a promise to pay money. Okay? And a promise to pay money is not money. But nevertheless, that's what they say the definition is. Coin money and such banknotes or other paper money as are authorized by law and do in fact circulate from hand to hand as the medium of exchange. There are several errors in that statement. There are no less than 3. One is that a banknote is not money, is not on the par with coined money. Paper money is not money, and paper has never been used as money. Paper is too heavy. Paper money was in the form of notes or IOUs, and an IOU for money is not money any more than an IOU for a hat or an IOU for a pound of butter could be a hat or a pound of butter. And in fact, I like that word, in fact, circulate from hand to hand as the medium of exchange. Well, what is it that circulates from hand to hand? And again, Federal Reserve notes circulate from hand to hand, but they do not import or export anything in direct proportion to the numerical figure in the corners of those bills. If they did, then the paper would have to increase. If you were using paper as money, you'd have to have 100 times more paper in a $100 bill. But who would want to use paper as money anyway? The Federal Reserve will tell you that we don't use paper as money. They'll tell you that we use credit. And you recall the Federal Reserve System works only with credit. Page 12, Keeping Our Money Healthy, Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 1977. And on and on. They tell you that there's no cash in checking accounts, for example. Well, if there's no cash there, then you can't cash checks. Why can't you cash a check? Because the cash is money, Carolyn versus Young. There is nothing being used as money in the United States. No matter how many times people use the word money, that doesn't make it so. Okay? Now, the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792, but Section 11 said that all the gold and silver coins which shall be issued from said mint, which was the Philadelphia Mint at that time, shall be as money. Okay? Thomas Jefferson knew what was going to be used as money. Banknotes and paper money were promises to pay money, and thus not the money, but proxy tokens that substituted for the money that was allegedly sitting in a bank or treasury vault. Therefore, if you wanted to make the statement that there was this stuff called paper out there, and there is paper, but it's not money, that circulates from hand to hand as if it were the money, as if it were the medium of exchange. The money or the medium of exchange still sitting in a bank vault. Okay. Now, I had mentioned a gold coin standard, a gold bullion standard, and a gold exchange standard a couple of minutes ago, and I used the word or a rather than the word the, since again, there can be and have been many different gold coin standards, many different gold bullion standards, and many different gold exchange standards. So much for the stability you may have associated with the word standard. Now, you might want to ask your accuser as to which of those three basic standards he or she presumes you are advocating America return to, particularly since neither the United States Constitution nor the Bible authorize or justify any of them, not even 100% redeemable certificates or notes, which bring their own set of problems to the table. We've dealt with these in earlier messages and will doubtless restate them in another broadcast. Meanwhile, on the other side of a break, I see we've got a break coming up now, we'll be asking some economists for a quick rundown on these three different gold standards. The first economist we're going to visit will be Dodd and Hasek. In their textbook called Economics Principles and Applications, will be going to the third edition, 1957. Who are these people? James Harvey Dodd, Ph.D., Chairman of the Department of Economics and Business Administration, Mary Washington College, University of Virginia. Carl W. Hasek, Ph.D., formerly head Department of Economics and Commerce, Pennsylvania State University, and their consulting editor, T.J. Hailstones, Ph.D., Professor of Economics, Director of Business Administration Programs, Xavier University in Cincinnati. Welcome back to this half of Datum Line. And we're going to be dealing with economic myths, which are so prevalent, which sustain the present system, which doesn't use anything as money. And if you're going to use a system that uses nothing as money, in other words, they just use credit, intangible credit, or what the Federal Reserve calls faith or confidence, which are also intangible, then you've got to produce a lot of mythology in order to hold this confidence game together, because that's exactly what it is. And we've already dealt with the subject of the confidence game in a previous broadcast. But we're turning now to Dodd and Hasek, Economics Principles and Application, page 391, bottom of the page, if you happen to have a copy of this one, third edition. Gold standards, plural. At one time or another, they say, and in different nations, one of three types of gold standards has been used. Page 392 at the top of the page. Subtitle, The Gold Coin Standard. Quote, the nature and operation of the gold coin standard may be illustrated by reference to the standard in use in the United States from 1873 to 1933. So they go back a little further than Black's Law Dictionary, which only went back to 1900. During most of this time, gold performed the following services in the monetary system. 1. The monetary unit, the dollar, was defined as 25.8 grains of gold, 9/10 fine, okay, 23.22 grains of fine gold. All right. Owing to the pliability and softness of pure gold, gold coins contained an alloy in order to give them hardness. The Gold Standard Act of 1900 defined the dollar as 25.8 grains of gold, 9/10 fine. All right. Number 2, gold coins were legal tender. No, they were lawful tender. That was Section 16 of the Coinage Act, April 2nd, 1792. Legal is only the form of law. Lawful is the substance of law. And tender is only an offer. Gold coins, when you passed a gold coin to someone, you weren't just offering. You were paying. Okay? Gold coins were legal tender. That is, an offer to pay a debt. No, gold coins paid the debt, sorry, in gold, and constituted a legally satisfactory offer to discharge a financial obligation. Well, a gold certificate was the offer to pay the gold. When you passed the gold, that was the payment. 3, there was free and unlimited coinage of gold bullion. Okay. 4, there were no restrictions on the use of gold. Oh, sound like a free country, huh? Gold could be used either as money or as a commodity in the arts and in industry. It could likewise move freely from the arts and industry to money. Nor were there any restrictions upon imports and exports or the use of gold in paying international debts. 5. In practice, all money, things start falling apart here, all money in the monetary system was convertible directly or indirectly into gold. Well, gold and silver were to be as money. So what was it that you converted into money that wasn't gold or wasn't silver? It was IOUs. And IOUs, again, were not the money. They only substituted for it. That's all they tell us about the gold coin standard. They don't attempt to tell us that only 40% of the Federal Reserve notes, when the Fed opened for business in 1914, could actually claim the gold right up front. You couldn't open up a checking account with only a 40% reserve and redeem, if you could, your checks with only 40% of a deposit. Okay? You couldn't do that. But banks could do that. But the economists just don't seem to get around to telling us that there was not 100% redeemability, even though the public thought there was, and the public should have thought there was because every note said it was redeemable. The facts were different, however, from what the words said. The second standard they talk about on this same page, 392, is the gold bullion standard. We'll read that. It's just one paragraph long. That's all it takes, apparently, to define a gold bullion standard. Quote, if a government wishes to discourage the circulation of gold, so who's sovereign? The people or government? Well, the government's sovereign. If a government wishes to discourage the circulation of gold, it may refuse to coin the metal into money. Well, the Coinage Act didn't provide for them being able to refuse. The original Mint Act said that they were going to do it. All you had to do was to bring the gold to them, and they would strike it into coin form for you. Okay? It may refuse to coin the metal into money, but continue to use gold in the other ways indicated above. Oh, so you're just going to back the IOUs. In such a case, it would be appropriate to refer to the standard as the gold bullion standard. When England entered World War I, she abandoned the gold standard. Now, that was a gold coin standard she was on at that time. And when in 1925 she resumed the gold standard, it was provided by law that the metal was not to be coined and that other kinds of money in the system could be redeemed in gold bars of not less than 400 ounces. You had to have enough claim checks in your pocket to be able to get 400 ounces of gold before you could have the gold. Now you figure what the market price, we'll get around to the subject of the price of gold because that's another misnomer. You figure what at $1,600 to $1,700 an ounce, what it would cost you to get 400 ounces of gold. So is this a system that favors the guy on the street, or is this a system that favors the super rich? At that time, or at the time, this meant that such a bar of gold, now this is 1957, correction, they're referring to 1925. The book was written in 1957. At the time, this meant that such a bar of gold was worth about $8,268. Well, that was at the so-called official price of $20.67 an ounce. You multiply 20.67 by 400, and you'll get $8,268. However, that was not the price of gold. That's another myth, and we're going to cover that in another broadcast. They went on to say, this limitation on the redemption privilege, so it's not a right. It was supposed to be your gold, but you can't get it back. It's now just a privilege to get the gold back that was once yours. This limitation on the redemption privilege tended to discourage individuals from asking for gold. Discourage, I guess. You had to be able to get 400 ounces of it. And there weren't very many people who could afford to pull down 400 ounces of gold. So they say, as practical monetary devices, there is little difference between the gold bullion and the gold coin standard. I beg to differ. Under a gold coin standard, at least the general public was allowed to go get a piece of gold, even if it was only a $1 weight of it. Under a gold bullion standard, only the super rich could get the gold. They're moving in the direction, as you can see, because countries move from gold coin to gold bullion standard. They're moving in the direction of taking the gold away from the people. Okay, the third standard. This was the third step in this confiscatory scheme. This is the most vague description of a standard that these two authors and an economist who is the advising editor, if you will, this is the most vague one that they're going to explain, which is not really going to be an explanation, but I'll read it anyway. The gold exchange standard. Quote, sometimes a nation not on the gold standard arranges for its citizens or itself to make payments for imports of goods and services in money that is equal in value to gold. Well, what would be equal in value to gold? Well, if a country was using silver, like in the United States, then a dollar of silver in the United States would have been equal in value of gold so long as you had $16 of silver. And that was considered to be equal in psychological value to $1 of gold, which was a much smaller coin. And we've already covered that in the previous broadcast, and you've seen those in the visual aids. An arrangement, I like that word, an arrangement is made whereby the nation not on the gold standard can convert its money. Well, what were countries using as money? Most countries were not using very much as money. They were using IOUs, dishonored IOUs even, as if they were money. But they could convert those into the money of a nation that is on the gold standard at a certain rate of exchange. To illustrate the principle involved in such a gold exchange standard, suppose that the United States is on the gold standard and that the government of the Philippines is not. Suppose further that the Central Bank of the Philippines makes a deposit in the New York Bank and that the New York Bank agrees to buy or sell Philippine pesos. I wonder what the deposit was. Going to buy or sell Philippine pesos at the rate of P2, which would be 2 pesos, for $1. I would ask a question. $1 of what was the bank going to buy? 2 pesos. I could almost offer 100 pounds of free money even back in those days, but I will make an offer of 100 pounds of free money today. $1 of what? To buy 2 pesos. You can identify that, I'll give you 100 pounds of it absolutely free. Quoting Hasek and Dodd and Hasek again, quote, then, as long as other nations have faith in the arrangement, Philippine money, or currency, now you know they're talking about paper here, used in international trade, bears a constant, I like that word, constant relationship to gold because it is exchangeable at a fixed rate for American money, which is based on gold. So American money wasn't gold. In fact, American money wasn't even silver. Okay? And the value of that so-called American money continued to decline. And if you look at the chart, you'll notice that Federal Reserve notes, which most people erroneously call money, are now worth no more than 3% of what they were worth back in 1914. So that's quite a depreciation in almost 100 years. So where is the constant? Where is the stability in this sort of a system? What we're doing is we're hitching our wagon to a moving object, and that moving object doesn't even represent anything tangible. So they go on to say that at times certain nations have found it expedient to arrange a gold exchange standard, but the disadvantages of such a standard have eventually offset its advantages. I'm going to read just the last sentence. There's not too much in the paragraph preceding this. But for 30 years or more, wars and unsettled conditions in foreign trade have made the simpler form of the gold standard impracticable. The simpler form of the gold standard was the gold coin standard, and then the gold bullion standard. Why were the simpler forms unworkable? Well, because there was not enough gold to cover the ocean of IOUs that were created by war and those unsettled conditions. And they had to abandon the use of gold coins. There were too many IOUs that couldn't pay. Was the problem gold, or was the problem that somebody was creating too many IOUs and trying to pass them as if they were valid? You know, we can go back further in time to 1935 and still find 3 different gold standards spoken of. And this from Professor Edwin W. Kemmerer in his book, Money, 1935. And we will turn to page 70, where he speaks of the gold coin standard. I'll quote just a little bit here. Under the gold coin standard, the unit of value is the value of a fixed quantity of gold in a free gold market. And this gold is coined without appreciable coinage charge into money, which circulates freely. For example, in the United States in 1932, the unit of value was the gold dollar, consisting of 25.8 grains of gold, 0.900 fine. This dollar was coined in gold pieces of the denominations of $2. Well, just a minute now. This dollar was coined in gold pieces of the denominations of $2.50, $5, $10, and $20. How do you coin a dollar as $20? When is a dollar $20? When is a dollar $10? A dollar is not $20. A dollar is a dollar. A dollar is a weight of gold and silver. But you see, he's turned the dollar into something, I guess, in the way of a tangible. And so you can have a dollar being $2.50, $5, $10, and $20. The language is being turned on its head. He says anyone could take standard gold bullion to any American mint and have it coined into gold coin. Okay, that's fine. And receive for his bullion the full amount of the coin into which it was coined, less the above-mentioned charges. There was a seigniorage charge. You could get around that seigniorage charge if you were willing to wait a little bit, I think. And you could just swap bullion for coin. But I think if you made the demand immediate, they could charge you something like 0.5%, if I recall, from the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792. They said, furthermore, owners of standard gold bars, which would be 90% pure, could sell them at the practical gold parity for Federal Reserve notes at any of our 12 Federal Reserve banks. Can you imagine that? Well, first off, you can't sell gold for a note. A note can buy, gold can buy the note, but notes can't buy the gold. And the notes began being only 40% redeemable in gold. So how could you possibly be selling gold bars for notes that could only claim 40% gold that was supposedly on deposit at the Federal Reserve? If you did that, you go to prison. Now, Professor Kemmerer on page 80 speaks of the gold bullion standard. I'll just take a few excerpts. During the decade following the war, he means World War I, because this was written in 1935, when most of the world returned to the gold standard, many countries, including Great Britain, substituted for the gold coin standard the so-called gold bullion standard. He goes on. The paper money, no such thing, of the country is usually made interchangeable with gold bullion in the form of gold bars at one or more central offices. Redemption is usually authorized only in substantial amounts. I guess it would be, because that 400-ounce requirement means that you'd be paying somewhere close to $750,000 to get a 400-ounce bar at today's so-called price, which highlights my statement earlier on about the difference between how many dollars worth of gold, or the price of gold, versus a dollar weight of gold. One changes and the other one doesn't. I was talking about these 3 different gold standards, and we were looking at Professor Edwin Kemmerer's book, Money. I only extracted a couple sentences out of each of the first 2 standards, one being the gold coin and the other being the gold bullion standard. Professor Kemmerer defines basically the gold coin standard in 2 pages between page 70 and 72. The gold bullion standard only requires about a paragraph, or a little bit more than that, page 80 and 81. Actually, it's less than 1 page. When it comes to the gold exchange standard, however, he needs 15 pages to tell you what that means. And the explanation isn't terribly clear, but I will take an extract from page 154 to show you what the object, he says, is of the gold exchange standard, which is, quote, the extension of the principal advantages of the gold standard to countries not financially able or, for other reasons, not willing to use gold coins in any considerable degree as media of exchange, or to redeem their fiduciary money in gold bars. In other words, any country, any government that doesn't want to redeem its fiduciary money, which is money sustained by faith, that's the circulating credit instruments, it's really not money, then they adopt a gold exchange standard. That's the one everybody's on now. He says, the gold exchange standard is essentially a mechanism for providing a gold standard without a gold currency. Usually in gold exchange standard countries, the money in circulation is mostly paper and silver. Keep in mind, this was written in 1935. The so-called money in circulation in countries today is nothing. It's electronic. It's just raw numbers. Oh, they use pieces of paper, some of them. We don't even use very much paper to move the imaginary money here in the United States. Most of the transfers of imaginary money are now done by checks or electronic transfers with credit and debit cards. So the advanced economies of Europe, the Americas and beyond, abandoned a variety of gold coin standards where, in the United States, for example, redemption of Fed notes by the Federal Reserve banks varied from a 40% possibility starting in 1914, then 25% beginning in 1945, and finally no possibility for redemption, 0%, by 1968. Even state-chartered banks of the 1800s often operated on a 25% legal monetary reserve, gold and silver, for redemption of their notes, with most of the socialist countries in the world today adopting a gold bullion standard where government and banknotes were allegedly backed by, but no longer redeemable in, substantive money, with exceptions possibly made for the very wealthy holders of public debt instruments in excess of certain minimums, subject to later revision, of course, like a 400-ounce minimum of gold in the UK after World War I. Calculate how many dollars of bank credit that amounts to in today's figures. You're now looking at approximately $750,000, which is a far cry from $8,268 during the 1920s when the so-called official price of gold was $20.67 an ounce. This highlights what I meant by a dollar's worth of gold versus a dollar weight of gold. Well, I hear the music. Can you hear the music? Yeah, I can hear the music. Okay, this is the end of this installment. And again, we've begun a new series, and this is going to be dealing with economic myths, and this was part 1. I'm Bruce G. McCarthy. This has been Datum Line. Have a good day.